talk about historical wrongs and righting those. We do know Black lives do matter into your institution, into all institutions, whether you're on the corporate side or within higher education as a whole, or nonprofit government entities, wherever you are. We know that right now these systematic barriers must be dismantled and must be destroyed. It's important for us to understand that a lot of this starts with this word I like to hear all the time that I travel and do these talks and have conversations, particularly on the corporate side of the house when we talk about hiring. Fit. Fit is a very interesting word that we use in our fields of hiring and employment and overall when we're trying to address systematic racism. We use fit too much because fit also ostracizes. Fit actually casts certain people who don't belong into a certain group. So when you tell me that, hey, I don't fit at Metropolitan State University, or I'm looking to recruit a faculty member and they must fit this, that automatically excludes somebody that looks like me. Because when you created this word fit and we created the ideation, what fit is for my organization, it never had me in mind. We also got to realize that we need to stop using this word and pivot to the word cultural add. We need to talk about how cultural add is the ability for people not to fit into the assimilation of what we want at an institution or a corporation, but what do they add value to us as far as the diversity, equity, inclusion, and the belonging space that we want to create. So it's important for us to understand that all of this word around fit, it's been studied even, right? We have researchers who have told us the influence of how organizations use fit in their hiring practice, in their cultural impact. And despite all of this research and how it's used, it's always been from a Eurocentric ideation. Never developed with Black, Indigenous, people of color, LGBTQ, all those communities and dominant identities and relationships. It's based upon elitism. The word fit is an elitist word. Crane and Shepard has described fit by some employers and organizations as an ambiguous criterion used to just justify what we said, social barriers in their hiring practice. So we really want to dive into that today and give you some opportunities, as Roderick will jump into in a few minutes, about how we're going to dismantle fit and think about cultural adds to your organizations. I want to do like Adam said. I want organizations and corporations to say they are the most anti-racist, woke institutions, woke corporations in America. But to be able to do that, you have to look internally at your organization. We know that most organizations will go out over the next year and try to go on a huge hiring spree. I'm going to hire more women. I'm going to hire more Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Hispanic, Asian Pacific Islander, all those communities. But you can hire all those individuals and yet still have a homogenous culture. So what you will have is a revolving door of bringing in great talent that looks like myself or looks like B and many of us on this call today, yet they won't stick around because your culture has not shifted to say what's inside my house. I've got all these different things in my house. I need to decorate it to make sure it reflects that. So it's important as we have this discussion, I want to give you some examples of that. We know that there's the commercialization of diversity right now. We realize that most organizations, if they're getting into things, they want to be more diverse. I sit on the board of a marketing firm, and a lot of times they're trying to address the different diversity needs they might have in some of their marketing and advertising. Well, we know this is not just a moment. It has to be a movement, and it has to be a journey that doesn't have a destination. And they see that's hard for many people because they feel like if I fill the numbers, if I fill the quota, if I do X, Y, and Z, we're good, right? No. This work around unpacking racism and systematic racism is a journey. It's going to take time. It's going to take pivots. It's going to take the ability to really address some things. Another example of that is the number of Black medical schools we have in this country. At one point in time, if you've ever studied history, we had more than the 4 that exist today. Yet, there was a doctor at the University of Louisville who said, there shouldn't be that many Black medical schools because there shouldn't be that many Black people who have a medical degree. And at one point in time in history, we had almost 11 Black medical or nursing schools. And so you start to wonder why, when we have these gaps, when we have these certain things in place, you have to understand that from the DNA, the systems were in place, the policies were in place, the laws were in place to stop people who look like me to be able to advance and live their great life. I tell the people the story of my grandfather coming home from World War II and trying to use a GI Bill, and he could not move to the suburbs. He could not attend the schools in the area. And why that was? Because of the tone of his skin. Also, we have to talk about this whole idea that the most educated group in America right now, fastest rising, is women, Black women particularly. And what are we doing to make sure we safeguard them and include them in a lot of the discussions that we're having about unpacking racism? We have to address this whole idea of showing up in the workspace. And I'll go back to fit and talk about culture ad. As I sit here looking like Frederick Douglass meets Wolverine, I drew this out on purpose. One, because of COVID, and my barber had COVID. Two, because I am actually being little militant in my own way, saying, hey, I'm able to show up and be me because I produce the best. And at the same time, I should not be judged how I look. The number one issue for more people of color is how they show up to work versus what is their work performance. We got to understand, when we look at job descriptions, we got to start doing certain things to change what job descriptions say. When you ask for 8 years of experience, 9 times out of 10, you're already alienating people of color. You're not putting the actual salaries on the jobs. Why? Because it's a proven factor. You'll have 20% more applications from people of color just by putting the job description, with not having years on it, and also saying what the salary is. It is funny, 90% of people of color, when they look at a job description, feel like they have to have almost 90% of the things on that job description, where the opposite is for my Caucasians brothers and sisters. They feel if I meet 40 to 50% of it, I will apply. We know if we look at higher education as a whole, we keep saying we need to recruit more Black and brown faculty and staff, yet no point in time in history has there ever been more PhDs, EDDs, Ds, period, of people of color that can come to your institutions. It's just, how is your culture and how are you recruiting them? And if you're not tapping into historically Black colleges and universities, naval colleges, Native American colleges, if you're not tapping into Hispanic serving institutions to build pipelines, to build the opportunity to increase your faculty and staff ranks, then you're missing out on that opportunity. We understand there's politics, but we also have to understand that when people show up to these spaces, they sometimes got a code switch, and that is something that you won't know about unless you have a dialogue with somebody that looks like me. We know it because we see it in healthcare right now. And if we examine healthcare, there are all these disparities. And right now there's this big major campaign to address how do we get more Black people to go ahead and take the vaccines. And yet Black people have told you for years, we don't trust medicine because of the Tuskegee experiment or gynecologist studies that were done on Black people. We understand that you need to look internally at your policies and your practices, because a lot of times in your policies and your practice at an institution or a corporation, they block individuals of color from advancing. And that a lot of your HR folks who are in certain powers don't even know what parameters or places to go to recruit people that look like me, yet you've given them the ability to say, we need to increase these amount or percentages in our organization. And the laws, if you haven't read the book, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, or The Color of Money, those two books alone should change your whole mind on the outlook of why we have these gaps. These inequality regimes probably even exist at the most anti-racist woke university at Metropolitan State University, because you've not addressed internally some of your policies, some of your procedures, and some things that you know that have blocked you from moving forward. Because this is hard work. This is work that some people don't want to do. Some people don't want to own up to it as far as that is concerned, but we know it exists because it's existed since the time of this country. We know that inequality regimes is designed for the preservation of white privilege, carefully constructed over centuries. So when we talk about our corporate policies, our regulations and rules of behavior, they have come from that. Excuse me. And last but not least, before I have to turn it over to my good buddy, Roderick, for we can jump into something, we want to talk about this diversity equity scorecard, which is an ability, and we'll have a great discussion around it, to really unpack some of your systems, some of your policies, some of your laws, some of your HR practices, and some of your recruitment efforts as a whole moving forward. Right next, I'm gonna turn it over to my good friend, Roderick. I am his Robin, he is Batman, and I'm gonna let him take it from here and we'll circle back.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Bates. And you know, he and I do a lot of tag teaming together. So thank you. I learn a lot every time I hear you speak. And so if you think about presentation as a show and tell, Dr. Bates did the tell, and I want to do a little show. And so when we talk about diversity and inclusion in corporate culture, a lot of times we need to talk about what that means. And you have to think about the historical context that Dr. Bates just laid out. Because a lot of times when you're doing DEI work, a lot of times people are starting from the point in time that they're presently in. but you can't address the root cause, which goes back, as Dr. Bates stated, hundreds of years. And when you have systems that were designed around homogeneity, right? When you have them that were designed at the exclusion of others, these inequities and these gaps continue to grow. Very few people even realize that after the Civil War ended, after the Emancipation Proclamation, a lot of people assumed that slavery ended and everything was even Steven. Very few people, if you ask them, do they know about the Black codes? Do they know about Jim Crow? People would jump to and say, well, what about the Brown versus Board of Education? What about, hey, everybody had equal access, separate but equal, but it wasn't equal. And so a lot of people don't understand what that did in terms of disadvantaging Black students and Black people in particular. A lot of people don't understand when you talk about, other laws that were being passed to try to level the playing field, so to speak, that Southern states and the governments in particular did many of the tactics that you see today, which is really like a lot of these stalling and going through the court systems to delay, to undermine, to where it maybe be 20 or 30 years before something even got remotely enacted to what the law, the federal law was stating. And so generations of Blacks fell behind because of these inequities and these stalling tactics and these clearly intentional practices to maintain a hierarchy that we see the remnants of today. So this work is hard. And so that's why we're here today to discuss that. And then as it gets into corporate culture, corporations are part of the culture. They're part of society, right? They're not apart from it. So these things that are in the society, they also bleed into your corporate cultures, into your academic institutions, into your healthcare institutions, into foster care, to the criminal justice system, going on and on. But they are part of the ethos, right? They're everywhere. It's like the matrix, right? When you look around, you can't see it and taste it and touch it, but it's everything, okay? And so, what I want to do is talk about that and talk about how we get into equitable hiring practices and what does that look like within a corporation. Talk about what does workforce diversity and representation look like at major companies today because of these, these systemic inequities. And talk about also for you in the audience, what does it look like? You have to understand what these workplace inequities look like. In my youth, and I'm not that old, but in my younger professional years, I didn't know what these things were called. Even though I felt them, I just didn't have the language to articulate what they were. And so I just thought that, wow, this doesn't feel good, but I didn't have the language. I didn't know what was going on, but it just didn't feel good. It wasn't until years later where I had the language to name it. And when you can name it, then you're able to be a little more resilient. You're able to find strategies to challenge some of these microaggressions and things that when you don't have the name, you don't even know what's going on, but you notice and you see that is only happening to you or others who are in a different, marginalized community or class or group within their organization. So we're going to talk about that so that you and the audience can understand what that looks like and you're able to face it and know how to address it. And then finally, we're going to look at, help you look at how do you evaluate prospective employers and what are some tools that you can use with this scorecard that Dr. Bates discussed. You can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so we talk about diversity and inclusion. And what will happen is a lot of times we talk about DEI, people will always want to jump to what's beneath the iceberg because they say, but wait a minute, there's all these other things as well. And so then diversity becomes everything and it becomes nothing, right? Because now it's just everything. And so people are very uncomfortable talking about race, ethnicity, and gender and age, but really race and ethnicity are the drivers. Those are the things, along with gender as well, but race is something that is paramount to the historic context of how the U.S. was founded. And until we address that and discuss in honest, conversations, how that impacts where we are today, that's why you see very little movement in terms of with the wealth gap and with all these other inequities that continue to persist, despite, the end of legal segregation or the end of legal slavery. People don't talk about all the other things that exist. So we're going to talk squarely about, race, ethnicity, your Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Next slide, please. So this is, I want to go through this real quick, but it's just for the audience. One thing that will help you is to do some research, like understand there's some theories, and Dr. Bates talked about a couple of theories, but go look at social identity theories, because these are theories that some are race neutral. Like, you could be in a country where everybody looks like you, and social identity theory holds, right? And so you need to understand it in the context of how systems were created here, similarity attraction theory, self-categorization theory, race and gender identity theories, justice theories, male privilege theories, unconscious bias theory. Go and understand those, because it will help you to either be an ally or an advocate for change within, dismantling the system that is very dangerous and very, inequitable to a number of people, and with Black people being at the end of that spectrum that get the brunt of these inequities. You got to understand what the context of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, what that means. And so if your ethnic group isn't listed here, that doesn't mean that any disadvantage or any underprivilege that you may have experienced or felt, that is not to lessen the experience. Okay. And so a lot of times what we talk about with Black, Indigenous, people of color, we're really talking about groups that have been historically disadvantaged and discriminated, because there's a long hundreds of years of history that was written into law, that was passed into informal laws. And so a lot of times we have to address those things so that people understand when that boat is lifted, then the whole boat for everybody, the tides lifted, all boats. But that's something that's really been holding back the tide, so to speak. And then you want to challenge those assumptions and long-held beliefs that either you individually may have or others around you may have, because individuals make up corporations, individuals make up systems. And so we need to like Dr. Bates gave you a couple of good books. There's so many books you can read, and conversations you can have, and podcasts you can listen to, webinars you can watch. But you do have to challenge and these beliefs that you may have had about a particular group of people, because that is going to be important to change the way we work and interact with each other, and even from a societal standpoint. But today we're talking more in the workplace. And so that's going to be something important for each of us to do. And then finally, you have to think about what your commitment to racial equity and social justice would be. Because otherwise, what would happen is you would do performative acts, and you would do, as Dr. Bates said, you would go out and you say, hey, okay, let's just hire a bunch of women, let's hire a bunch of, Latinx, Blacks and Americans, Asian Pacific Americans, let's just hire anybody that's considered Black, Indigenous, people of color, just to get the heat off our back. But what happens is, it's like anything else. If you do not want, imagine you don't want to invite somebody into your house. And if you feel that because of a law or because of societal pressure, because of consumers, you feel like, okay, I have to let you in order, to please people. Well, when I come into your house, how welcome do you think I'm going to feel? I'm probably not going to feel too welcome, because you really didn't want me there in the first place, right? And it doesn't matter about, all these cases for diversity. If you really inherently didn't want me there because of long-held beliefs, or you don't, you have a lack of commitment to racial equity, because you don't understand what that means. If you look at that as me advancing means you declining, then that's a challenge and that's a problem. So those are the things that Dr. Bates and I want to talk about to help people realize that if I rise, that doesn't mean you fall, right? A plus for me isn't a minus for you. And so I like to tell the real quick story. A lot of times that people will see there could be 100 job openings, right? And let's say there are 200 applicants, and there's 200 applicants for 100 job openings. There's 100, let's say, white applicants, and there's 100 Black applicants. So let's say 90 white applicants get, 90 of those 100 jobs, and then 10 Black applicants get the other jobs, right? So you have 90 applicants who've gotten the job and 10 applicants who've gotten the job. Well, what would happen is the white people who didn't get the job, they will look at, well, how did those 10 Black people get the job? Hey, that's not fair. Like, something, they must have gotten it because of affirmative action or something. They won't focus on the 90 white people who beat them out, which is a much larger pool. They would just look at the 10 people who got the job where they feel they didn't deserve the job because of their race and because of these beliefs. And so those are things that even the most progressive people can fall prey to, these stereotypes and these misperceptions because of the way we're raised in a society that was built on a lot of systemic racism. And it's in the system. And so a lot of times we have to root these things out. So let's talk about equitable hiring practices and what that looks like. So this is an example from Procter and Gamble. And once you have an idea, when Dr. Bates touched on it, looking at your job description. So as a company, when you are talking to companies or assessing companies, and if we have any corporate recruiters on the call, the key thing is, what processes or practices do you have in place to identify and remove bias from your job description? What practices and protocols do you have in place to remove bias from the sourcing channel? A lot of times you may use the same sourcing channel, which gets you the same, people that have always been in your company, right? That idea of fit, so to speak. So what other sourcing channels are you not taking advantage of? Because a lot of times people will say, well, we just couldn't find that talent. Well, what sourcing channels are you using? Yes, it's hard work, people. It's you have to go outside of the norm, right? Yes, it's easy to say, hey, we've always gotten our talent from this university. But if you want to become diverse and you truly want to bring in different ideas and perspectives, then you have to go and expand your sourcing channels. And so you also have to not look at only the business case for diversity, which we'll talk about later. So you want to look at the application. There's been studies about different assessments and different things that have inherent biases in them. So you want to make sure that anything you do use doesn't have any inherent biases that could be unfairly affecting a group. Interview questions. There's all types of illegal and illicit interview questions that can be asked if companies don't have the right type of training for their interviewers and hiring managers and recruiters. And then finally, what selection are you using? What's the criteria you're using for selection? Because a lot of times, if there's some biases there that you are not aware of, then you could be unfairly removing or not hiring people that really were, great candidates for that job. So this just gives you an example of what that looks like. And so in the next slide, I want to ask this question to everybody. So workplace diversity is a no-brainer, right? Because the business case will have you believe that, and it's true, we look at the data, that all these things are good. And they're based on saying, hey, if you have diversity, it's going to be good for the bottom line because you have all these different thoughts and all these different people who can help connect you with your customers and all these different, ways to innovate and do all of these different things because you're basically pulling from a talent pool that you didn't even consider or utilize before, right? So that's all well and good. Increased profits, increased creativity, better decision making, better company reputation, of course. If I look at a company and they have, great representation of different ethnic groups, I feel a lot better. It's like a restaurant. If I go into a restaurant I've never been in before and I look in there and nobody looks like me, I'm actually a little hesitant because I feel like, wait a minute, we're in 2021. If nobody looks like me in that restaurant, that means that's a message to me. That's like, okay, well, maybe there's a reason why nobody doesn't look like me. So I would actually leave. I go into that restaurant and I see that there are Black staff. There's maybe a Black manager in there. There's Black people in the place or other people of color. I feel a lot better because I feel it's a more welcoming environment. So all these things are true. Reduce employee turnover, all of that. Go to the next slide. But the reality is different, yes? Because if we look at the data tells me something different. So if I say, wait a minute, if all these things are good, if there's billions of dollars spent a year on diversity recruitment, and that's with the actual cost of recruitment, including marketing and expenses and travel and reimbursement, billions of dollars are spent each year, if not, but yet the numbers tell me a different story, especially when we get into the upper ranks of leadership. And so when you start looking at leadership, which is I've been doing a particular research and looking at what is Black representation, what does that funnel look like as you come into the organization, as an individual contributor, as part of the employee workforce. And then as you advance into, first line, mid-level, senior executive level positions, then the percentage of Blacks and people in color starts shrinking, right? And there's some variances, right? Depending on the industry and depending on the person of color, because every ethnic group is not going to have the same experience, but your historically disadvantaged groups tend to track along that same experience. And so if you look down here in this screen, it's a little difficult to see, but if you look at with this particular company, Cisco, and this is all public data, it's in their DEI report, and these are things that they are, have strategies to try to address as well. And that's why I applaud companies like this for being transparent with their data. You look and you see, well, for U.S. managers by ethnicity, you see for your Hispanic, I think it's at 5%, Black and African Americans at 2%, and then your Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, American Indian, those are all less than 1%, okay? And what does that tell you? Now, that can tell you that, okay, well, either we're just grossly underrepresented in our representation in leadership for Black and Indigenous people of color, or we're overrepresented with our employees who identify as white, right? So one or the other, both things can be true, but then you can also say, okay, are we underrepresented because there's just not enough people in the pipeline, or are there some structural practices that we have and barriers that have historically not provided opportunities for promotions into leadership opportunities for this group, okay? Next slide, please. Here again, it's another example. So I want to show you about one of the major top consulting firms in the world, PricewaterhouseCoopers. If you look at their data, very similar data, and they're, again, being very transparent. They're showing, but these percentages start looking eerily the same, right? So you start seeing your Black, African American, Latinx, Pacific Islanders, all of these, start seeing very low percentages. And then you see for your white male and white female, those percentages are higher as it pertains to leadership, right? As it pertains to getting into these director and executive director roles. And the good thing, what I did love about PricewaterhouseCoopers, they actually put in their transparency report, they actually put in strategies. They actually stated, look, we recognize that this is a problem. We have done internal research and audits, and we have discovered that we did have some systemic barriers in place that negatively impacted the probability that anyone from these underrepresented groups would ever move into the upper echelons of our organizations. We have recognized that. We've actually uncovered it. And so we put in place some interventions. And so they went and put in place some interventions and some specific strategies to address that. And so I applaud these types of companies, because this, to me, is what Dr. Bates would call as well. This is going beyond the performance, right? Now you're getting into substantive strategy. Now you're getting into figuring out how do we dismantle this? How do we intervene and put in some corrective action so that our Black talent, our Latinx talent, and other talent that we have identified is being unfairly maligned in this, hurt in this process of advancing through the organization. Matter of fact, after 2 years, a higher percentage of this population was leaving the organization. So only when the company said, okay, something's wrong, because they're leaving at a higher clip than our white counterparts. And so you do these culture surveys, what they call them climate surveys, culture surveys, how many names. But the company would ask the same questions. They'll say, okay, hey, how do you feel about your chances of advancement? How do you feel about fairness? Well, typically in these organizations, the white employees would say, hey, everything's good. The percentage would be like, hey, it's fine with me. I'm good. But then when you look at the data, the disaggregated data for your Black and Latinx and other groups, then their percentages are a lot lower. They don't feel that way. And so you do have to examine, like, well, why is it that one group feels like everything is good, that they feel like the process is fair, they have an opportunity to advance, and the other group doesn't feel that? This data bears that out. And so I love to use data to show you that, these things are not just in people's head, they're actually played out, in real life. Next slide, please. Okay. There's another example, Altria. They're one of the examples I like, because they put their strategy in their report as well. And they would tell you, hey, we recognize some issues. Here are our aiming points. Here's where we need to get to. We realize that we are artificially underrepresented in leadership across these particular demographics. And here's where we've set a target to get here. And how do we get here? It doesn't mean that we just pick anybody off the street and just say, hey, look, we just need to get these numbers up. We're just going to hire you. No, it goes into looking at their internal practices. Listen to, who have you identified as a high potential employee? Who have you identified as a promotable, what we call our corporate promotables, right? Who have you identified to put into your leadership development programs? Who have you identified for succession planning? This is where a lot of the systemic, inequities and racism shows up, right? And when we say racism, I don't want people to think of the Ku Klux Klan and the George Wallaces, because that's what a lot of times people would think of that. And they would say, well, certainly that's not me, so I'm not racist. We're talking about racism as a system, right? And that's why you need to understand those theories that I talked about earlier, because a lot of that comes into play, these social identity theories and these similarity attraction theories. That's part of it. And then there is a part also that is anti, right? Anti-racist, anti, being against, Blacks and being against people of color, that can be, unconscious and conscious, because that is in the system. And so a lot of times these things people not even conscious of it or aware. But when you look at the data, you start saying, why are these percentages so low? So what do we need to do to, what barriers are existing? Like, why are people not advancing? This person seems very smart. Everybody says they're smart, yet they're not able to advance, right? So I applaud companies like Altria that show that data and show that they have strategies and to try to ameliorate those challenges. Next slide, please. So this is a company that I was showing as well. It's called Viva Systems. And I just, was looking at this company literally a week ago. And you look at their data and, pretty much tracks the same, probably a little lower. But what I found curious, they, in one of their statements, they said, well, we don't have any aiming points, any targets that we are trying to get to in terms of our diversity of our leadership, because we treat everybody the same, and we feel that we feel that just by treating everybody the same and making sure that we get training, everything should be good. And so I thought that was an interesting statement, because I said, well, if you look at the numbers, these are pretty low to just say that you don't need to do any type of intervention, because otherwise what you're saying is that, okay, are you're really grossly underrepresented. And the myth could be that either Black people and other races are not qualified to become managers, or they have to work so hard that you'll get these exceptional 1 or 2%, and then people say, okay, yeah, but that's just an exception, right? And so we want to get away from that type of thinking. So we want organizations to do some internal analysis to see, look, are there some artificial barriers that have percentages of talent and other people in our communities at such a low rate within leadership positions, right? So now we start moving beyond, like I said, the business case, because if the business case was so good, right? If it was so compelling to executives and board, managers and leaders and hedge fund managers, people that invest a lot of money in these organizations, if the business case of diversity truly held true, then you would see higher numbers if we're looking at racial and ethnic diversity. So that means that the business case alone can't explain everything. It's not a compelling enough argument, because it'll get you to the door, to get you to the performative act. But a few years in, a lot of these people will walk. They will vote with their feet, because they're going to face a lot of microaggressions and harm that their counterparts don't face. So those are those things that you have to kind of go a little beneath and understand, well, why is this population so low? And then that's when you transition to more of a what we call a social justice case, where you're saying, hey, I believe that people, regardless of their race, ethnicity, gender, their sexual orientation, what have you, have a right to equitable experiences, have a right to the same privileges that I do, a right to the same job that humans, right? If you have that more than equity type of mindset and social justice type of mindset, then you begin to look at people not as cogs in the wheel to just increase profit, but you look at them as talent that will help you achieve your organizational goals, but also supporting the broader community as well, right? There's a CEO for Merck, I believe his name is Kenneth Frazier. He underscored this by saying, well, there isn't a business case to hire white people, right? Like he said, nobody's running around saying, hey, we need a business case to hire white people, like, and so he said, when you think about having a business case for diversity, what that really is saying is almost like somebody say, okay, I've got to figure out a way just to force you to hire someone that you normally just wouldn't hire because of reasons that have nothing to do with their ability to do the job or perform this job, or to create, services or products for your organization. And how do I get you? So I've got to get you to focus on making money, because maybe you'll say, okay, well, I guess if you show me 20%, having 20% of women on the board will increase my profits by, 50%. Okay, it's just too much money for me to turn down. But it tells you nothing of the experience that woman is probably going to have being on a board that didn't want her there in the first place, right? So talking about, like what Dr. Bates said earlier, these systems were designed, they weren't designed with me in mind. When people talk about, the Declaration of Independence and all these, laws and all these, pledges, it's like, well, but the founding people weren't thinking about me. And so because of that, those things tend to bleed into your policies and practices and rules. And we're in this system where we're trying to make sure that we truly live up to those ideals of having true inclusion. Next slide, please. Again, this is just a real quick JP Morgan. So they're very transparent with their data. And again, you see those percentages tend to track a little higher. They're a little higher in terms of representation in the banking industry, but not that much. They're still around that, between that 2 and 5% range. So based on my research, that's typical. That's what's been typical. However, JP Morgan is a top company, and they do have a lot of practices in place that go way beyond the performance. I urge you to look at their website. They have an Advancing Blacks in Leadership program. They have an Advancing Women in Leadership program. They do a lot in the community. They make pledges well over $1 billion, not only in the U.S. To support the Black community in terms of biodiversity, education outcomes, entrepreneurship, economic mobility, loans, access to loans, reinvesting in communities that have been really, dying, so to speak, for lack of investment. They've also done this in the UK and other regions across the world where they have a significant underrepresented population, especially Blacks and people who've been unfairly kind of excluded from the system. Next slide, please. This was from a report that McKinsey did. You may have seen it. So it talked about women in the workplace. And so you can see, from entry level, let's say, and this is, they do this every year. It's been the past 6 years they've been doing it. So for 2020, they said, well, 35%, white men entered the workforce. And if you see that white men are the only ones that are overrepresented in relation to the numbers they come in at entry level. So they come in entry level 35%, but then there's 60% in the C-suite. So they're overrepresented in terms of if you're comparing the entry level, right? Men of color, their percentages go down the higher up they go in the organization. White women, same thing, they go down. And you see what women of color have it the worst. Like they have the biggest drop off. And so this report had a spotlight on your Black and Hispanic women. Typically, a lot of times we hear Black and brown people, we're talking about Black and Hispanics or Black and Latinx, but they had it the worst. And so that's something for you to take into consideration and to learn about. In an advocate, in an ally, if you're a recruiter or administrator, faculty, a staff member, or somebody in the community, this data can help you understand that there are some unique challenges that our women of color experience that really, prevent them or hurt their chances of moving further up the ranks in the organization. Next slide, please. So here's some indicators of workplace inequity. So I told you, I want you to be woke, right? I want you to understand what you're getting into before you get into it. And some of you have already experienced these things. You just probably maybe can articulate it or you didn't know what it was because a lot of times, nobody just wants to always think the worst, right? It's a terrible thing if you go through society assuming the worst of everybody, right? That's no way to live. But you do need to recognize when you are unfairly being mistreated, so for your own mental health and your own physical health, and you can know what mechanisms may exist within that organization or external to it to seek relief. These are percentages, and I have the sources at the bottom. But you see that people who experience microaggressions in the workplace are more likely to quit. Well, what the Seneca was saying is, well, everybody experiences microaggressions. Right? Exactly. Microaggressions, if you go look at the definition of it, it's not like it's just something that's the domain of people of color, right? What happens is we're going to be the ones more likely to quit because of all the other baggage, because of all the historical context of what we were already dealing with. And so these things tend to push us over the edge and just say, you know what, we've got to get out of here because they're more harmful, okay? If you look at another bullet point at the bottom, it talks about stereotypes of people of color in the workplace contribute to a higher emotional tax burden. Those are things we talk about all the time. We talk about this extra tax that we pay as a person of color within the workplace for a number of reasons, number of stereotypes, right? And these things come in a lot of different forms that would be for another presentation. So I won't be able to get into all the details, but these percentages are real, okay? Next slide. And so this talks about the impact of discrimination and microaggressions. And so there was some research done by the National Association of Colleges and Employers late last fall. And so this detail is directly from them. And they talked about, 45% of ethnic minorities, they chose not to pursue a job because of a perceived lack of inclusion. And so as an organization, just like I talked about with the restaurant example, if I look into a restaurant, literally, I'm not going in there because I don't want to be the first. That is a place where I don't want to be the first. wherever I'm going to eat. I don't want to be the first one. I don't want them to say, hey, yeah, you're our first Black customer. No, I don't want to be the first. So I need to look in there and see that somebody's come before me, because there, I don't want to be a front runner. I want to see that, okay, you're good. You're open to other people being in here. You truly are an inclusive establishment. But the same is true for the place of work. So when talent is choosing or looking, shopping around for where they want to utilize their talents, right? Where they're going to take their talents, like LeBron James said, well, you're going to start looking. This talent is going to go to your website. They're going to go on, different sites. They're going to, look at the low-hanging fruit in terms of how they can access who you are as an organization. If they have access to talk to alumni or anybody who's had experience with your organization. So it's very important how you present your company online, the images, the pictures you use, the internet you make transparent. Very important. Okay. And so you look at these positions, these other statements I like to call attention to, how microaggressions manifest: self-doubt, isolation, imposter syndrome. Go do some research on these terms if you're not familiar with them, because a lot of times you may not even know that you've experienced them or that you are experiencing them until you know the definitions, right? So it's almost like racism and racist and prejudice and bigot. I tell people, go look at those definitions, because a lot of times people will call something that, if somebody's being prejudiced or a bigot, they'll call that racist. And they'll say, oh, this is racist. Like, no, it's just a bigot. This person's just being prejudiced. Like, racism means this, or being a racist means this. And if you don't understand that language and those terms, a lot of times those terms lose their power. And a lot of times that's been by design as well. But you need to understand what these terms mean. Next slide, please. And so now we get to what Dr. Bates talked about, is how we operationalize equity, and what does that mean for you? What does that mean for employers that you engage with? How do you assess these employers? And so with this scorecard, the way I created it was a lot of research and looking at, okay, how does the organization actually implement or pursue their diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice strategies? And what are they actually trying to do, and to what end goal, right? And what are the major categories that need to be addressed, right? Whether an organization addresses these or not, but through my research and through my own experiences, just understanding, how not only the workplace works, but also communities and major academic, institutions and broader society. What are those major categories where an employer has a footprint? And so when you are looking at an employer as a potential place for you to work, you do want to understand this people and inclusive leadership perspective. That is like the example I told you of looking into the restaurant and seeing if there's any diversity there, right? Because this is the snapshot, like I just showed you. This would be a snapshot of, hey, what do your employee demographics look like? What does your management and leadership demographics look like, right? And some would even have, from a succession management standpoint, demographics on that as well. Now, with these indicators, these key performance indicators, and these four color-coded perspectives, every company is not going to have everything, and that's not the point. What this does is give you a guide, a framework, if it, as it were, to ask the right questions, right? So, for example, what you definitely want to ask about, the people and inclusive leadership practices, and what does that mean for you, right? But each of these key performance indicators actually breaks down further into other criterion, right? And so, for example, if we look at what I call career pathing programs, right? What that means, does a company have specific, and this is important, does a company that you're interested in, does it have a formalized path to leadership, or is it informal? And I'll tell you the difference. If it's informal, it's probably not good for people that look like me. It's probably not good because it's informal. And as Dr. Bates alluded to earlier, I'm not going to have the access to those informal networks by and large for a corporation that wasn't designed or founded by people that look like me, unless I go to a corporation that was founded and designed by people who look like me, which is not going to be the norm in the American context. Okay, so we're talking about the American context. So within the American context, informal career path programs or career pathing programs, it's probably not going to work for me. But I'm not going to be the one that somebody's going to tap on the shoulder and say, hey, you know what? We think you're a good person for leadership and promotion. We're going to start mentoring you. I'm going to connect you with XYZ person. That's probably not going to happen for me. So you want to see, like, are there some formal processes and programs in place where you can say, if I do A position, B position, C position, I have prepared myself for X leadership role. If I do that role, that's going to prepare me for X, Y, Z. And you can see clearly on a map or some type of lattice or ladder type structure what each position is preparing you for. So it takes a lot of the guesswork out of how do you prepare yourself for these coveted positions that you may or may not want to pursue, okay? If we go down the ladder, and this is designed like a ladder, and actually, you know, from an organizational standpoint, I tell companies you need to start from the bottom up, okay? But if we go down, we look at, let's say, retention and advancement, for example, or employer branding and recruitment, then the questions you should be asking there are what type of recruitment strategy does the company have and how fair is it? And so you want to see evidence that the company has actually had some type of training for their hiring managers and their recruiters and everybody else in terms of, you know, how do they remove biases from, you know, the hiring process? Do they have what's called like a Rooney type of rule? And a Rooney rule, if you keep up with football, it's basically, it goes back to diverse slate strategy where you say, hey, you know, for us to present like a slate of candidates for, let's say, our, you know, our interview rounds, then they have to include at least, you know, one woman, one person of color, you know, at the bare minimum, if you were to have like that. Because otherwise what happen if you never include anyone from these gender or racial groups, then the likelihood that they're going to get hired, of course, it just goes down. So you want to include as many as you can. And we're not talking about just picking people for the sake of picking people, but what we're saying is that, you know, trying to include people and make sure that you're not unfairly biased against including them in these second and third round of final round interviews that are the places where the final decision actually gets made, right? So these may seem like questions where you say, yeah, I don't know if I should ask that question of a recruiter, or I don't know. Trust me, I've done the research. A lot of the good companies actually have this data. They would actually put in their reports that, yes, we are doing this. Yes, we are looking at our job descriptions and making sure that they're using gender neutral language, or they're not unfairly using like more male dominant language that would turn off, people that identify as female, for example, or we're using language that is race neutral, so it's not unfairly, kind of turning off people who don't identify as white. They may feel like, yeah, this is not for me, right? So language is very important. So you can find companies that actually have stated that they do that, they have that training. In the case that they don't, it's a great question for you to ask, because it'll tell you about what you may be getting yourself into and just how you need to prepare yourself. So this scorecard provides a framework that there's a lot of questions that are attached to each of these indicators that you see here that make up the subcomponents of these perspectives. And so we ask these questions of our employers, but we're also developing workshops to help students learn how to ask specific questions that will help them to really evaluate an organization's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as social justice. And I believe that's the last slide. Nope, there's one more. So this was an example. Thank you, Tierney. So this was an example I did want to show you before I end and we go to see if there are any questions for myself and Dr. Bates. This is an example of Hilton. And so you see, they do put in here in terms of their recruiting, they state our sourcing efforts and scholarship support are targeted across a broad set of talent pools, including Black, Hispanic, Asian, Pacific Islanders, and Hispanic, serving institutions. And then they tell you also in this first paragraph how they source and hire diverse talent. They say that they have established 30% diverse hire targets, right? And then they said they want a third diverse candidate slates for all their director and above positions. When you see a company putting that in writing, those are the companies that you need to run to, because they are actually holding themselves accountable, because this is in their diversity report. So I'm not making this up. They're like, hey, check this out. We're telling you, like, we're really committed to diversity and inclusion, right? And if you go down to the bottom where they talk about leading, you see here, they talk about they have an increased focus on accountability. You want to see that language because it lets you know that, hey, this company is serious, that they really are trying to increase their diversity, where they say 35% females, 20% ethnically diverse, because they realize they've had some problems and challenges and they've gone through and done the hard work. You go to the next slide. I believe I did have one more example. Yeah, real quick, this is a good one. This is American Express. Again, a great company. when you look at their recruitment and retention strategy, first of all, they show you all of their affinity groups, otherwise known as employee resource groups, business resource groups. They go by many names, but these groups are something you want to look for in a company as well if you're a job seeker, because it just lets you know, first of all, use my restaurant analogy that, hey, the organization truly is inclusive and has, it's open on the surface for people like me. So they have these groups that I can at least learn and network and find people that look like me, just to ease into the organization to learn the ropes, right? Doesn't mean I'm not going to become part of the broader corporate community, but these groups just help, especially when you're in the minority. And then you look at this second paragraph where they talk about recruiting diverse colleagues, right? So they're making statements here about their commitment to that. And then finally, and look at what they include at the bottom. They're saying for their hiring leaders and recruiters, we provide them with resources, including tips on drafting inclusive job descriptions, right? Sourcing candidates, reviewing resumes, interviewing, and making hiring decisions, right? Think about that. That is a very powerful statement from a very large global corporation in American Express. And this last piece that I'll leave you with before we end our presentation is advancing diverse talent. Look at this statement. We offer a year-long mentoring program to high-performing diverse colleagues in the United States, because we're talking about the U.S. Diversity strategy. All right, mentees are matched with executive mentors. That's a very powerful thing. That's what I just talked about. You have to have those formal programs if you really want to retain and advance your diverse and underrepresented talent. You need to connect them with a mentor, right? They need to have somebody at the top that can help them navigate through this minefield that they're likely to experience being an underrepresented person within your organization, okay? And so I hope that, and I'm going to end here, and I hope that this has been enough information to help you understand the ways in which you as a job seeker can navigate, and understand these organizations. But also if we have any recruiters or employee relations professionals or career center professionals as well, using this framework in terms of how you talk with organizations that you want to invite on campus or that you want to participate in diversity themed events. Thank you.
Thanks, Roderick. And as you said, we're going to go ahead and get into it. If you want to contact us and learn more about what we're doing and what things we have in place with our diversity equity scorecard, please reach out to us. We'd love to share and have conversation around this, as me and Roderick are on this mission to unpack systematic racism, not only in corporate America, but also in our field of higher education as a whole. We'll pause there, follow us, email us, follow us on Instagram, as well as we have those conversations. We'll go to questions and answers. So first question, Roderick, for us is, in a virtual environment, does this make it more challenging to ensure you're interviewing people of color? Are you able to identify BIPOC based upon their application to ensure you are attempting to include that learn one BIPOC, one woman, et cetera, as you discussed? Well, let's be, Jeremy, as great question. And as people working in higher education, let's be honest, if you don't have a LinkedIn account, everybody goes look up the people on LinkedIn account in some regards. I mean, technology as a whole, it's sad, but when we see resumes, when we see these, we will go look people up to see who they are, specifically if there are a person of interest overall. In the virtual space, I think right now what we're seeing is actually a high demand for interviewing more people of color, specifically Asian Pacific Islanders, Native American students, Black, and Indigenous overall. And so what you're seeing in the field right now on most corporations, they're putting together a strategy like Roderick just talked about from a virtual space. And even in that strategy, as we looked at with Amex and Hilton, they're looking at it from a virtual lens as well. And so it can be challenging in some regards, but again, the great HR practices, the great ones who are taking the extra mile are going to be the ones that win at the end of the day.
Yep. Thank you, Dr. Bates. And I add on to that, what companies also do, I don't know how many jobs you've applied to, but you may find that, you may recall if you've applied to some, they would ask you, so there is it's a optional survey, but they'll ask you, when you're applying for an online application, how do you identify? What is your race, gender, whether you're a veteran, those types of questions. And so that's data that most companies have to collect from a federal law standpoint. They have to report to the Equal Opportunity Commission. So that data is collecting. So they can know, okay, well, what are you doing to make sure that you're not, unfairly discriminating against any candidates or applicants. And also, because for example, if a company says, well, we just don't have people that are applying that are from this demographic, then that data is there, right? But also, if a company says, hey, we're like grossly underrepresented, like we only have 1% Black people that work in our company, or 1% women, like surely it just can't be because there are no qualified women. Like there's something that's just artificially low, where you just can't say, well, it just must be the person's fault. That's when you say it's a system, it's a systemic, it's a structural issue. And so that data, Dr. Bates and I, we work with hiring systems, and so we collect that information even at the university level. Like when we're hiring, that's information that a candidate had to fill out in the HRIS system. And so that's phase one. So I can do specific just to make sure that, hey, let me make sure that I'm looking at these applicants, and I want to make sure that I'm looking at this data. Now, that data that you do submit on those surveys, that actually goes directly to the federal government. So that's not something that the HRIS system would capture, but it would be something that later on, if they were to come back, or if the school or hiring company said, we just can't find people, they said, well, but it looks like this is how many people actually have applied. So there must be something going on in your system to where you're not identifying or giving opportunities for interviews to people who identify as Black, Native American, Hispanic, or what have you. And so then, like the other thing what Dr. Bates said, you will be able to identify that talent as well through LinkedIn, through resumes. So it's not that you just say, hey, let me just go here and just look only for interview Black people. Only that's not what you're doing. You're going to look at your candidate pool. You're going to say, okay, which ones just meet the criteria? But therein lies the problem. And that's what Dr. Bates is talking about. When you just say, hey, let me look who meets the criteria, well, normally that's going to exclude me anyway, because of those things you talked about, because a lot of times you're doing it based on fit. And so there may be things, like you said, years of experience that you may think, but this is just neutral. I'm just saying 8 years of experience, but it could be, hurting a particular group, right? Or you could have certain language in there that could be, excluding a certain group from even applying in the first place. And so what happens in effect, you end up getting the same pool that you always got, right? And so those are things sometimes that companies do by design, and sometimes it's just an oversight. And so that's why a lot of it does come with examining the way you even write your job descriptions, the way your application process is, the language that's used in there. So then when I say, okay, now if I'm getting 100 job descriptions and for a job, well, I know I can tell you right now, there's never going to be 100 qualified candidates for one job. It just never happens. So most people, like Dr. Bates said, they may have 10% of the qualifications, they'll just apply, because they're going to say, well, you know what, I'm not going to exclude myself, you're going to have to exclude me. So you look at it and say, but this doesn't even meet, like, you may say, hey, master's degree required, because it may be. Or you may say, hey, you have to have an engineering degree, because for a certain job, you may say, no, you need to be an engineer. Well, somebody may just not have that degree and they may apply anyway. So those are ones you can just say, you know what, oh, we have to exclude this. If I say you need to be a nurse for this job because you're working in a hospital, and you say, well, I don't have a nursing degree, but I still want to work. Well, no, you're not for this job, right? And so out of that 100, you're going to naturally get down to like maybe, this is true, it's an 80-20 rule. Literally, you would maybe only have out of 100 applications, maybe 25 or 30 actually meet like those general, just baseline qualifications. And so there is where you want to be able to look at that pool and see, okay, is it inclusive? Do I have enough people from these different groups? Because otherwise, I got to go reach back into that bigger pool and see if I overlooked someone because of some unconscious biases or internal biases. And that could be for anyone. So it's not, I'm not immune to unconscious bias. So
Roderick, can I throw something out? Because you said something that was absolutely brilliant that I see all of us, I'll just say old guys with gray beards, that we find ourselves, right, Tierney? We find ourselves, I mean, I see it so much, and it was interesting how you had the data to support it, that what I see that, it's real that we feel like we don't belong, right? And so it was interesting to hear the percentages that you read of, here are the qualifications of a PD, right? And that BIPOC folks see the qualifications and feel like they got to check every stinking box, not just min quals, but preferred quals. And then sometimes the privileged may check 2-3 boxes and are like, well, I'm going to throw in, right? So can you really emphasize that and talk about how that could affect, because in the end, you know, our folks are in Minnesota, so they know ice fishing. Ice fishing is about how many holes you drill. And at the end of the day, you just drill one hole, you might catch a fish, but your odds go up if you drill more, especially when you don't know what's going on under the surface of the ice. And we often limit ourselves when we don't apply for positions because we think 3, 4 steps. Well, I don't know if I can do all of that. Well, you don't have to do all of that, right? I don't know if I'm ready to go there, because again, we have never been, if we're first generation as BIPOC folks, we're not only first generation college students and college graduates, we're first generation professionals. And so we have no mentors that are just like, look, throw in, dog. You know, the best thing to have is some choices. You could tell people no, but really how that manifests itself, because yes, you talked about from a corporate standpoint, but when you provided that data related to the percentages of people of color that apply for jobs and feeling how many of the qualifications they think they need to meet to apply versus non-people of color, I think that's really telling. Especially for our crew that's listening to this tonight.
And Adam, you're correct. You know, another thing to think about from an HR perspective is your ATS system. I think Jeremy asked a question. That was a good question. That what are the words you're looking for? I'll give you a prime example. If you see my resume, you're gonna see blickety black all through it. I'm a member of the 100 Black Men. I've done things around Black student organizations, all this other great stuff. So look at your ATS tracking system to look at certain verbiage and words. Use Texio, use Gender Decoder. These are systems that help you with your job descriptions to get more in line to what you're looking for, and also to attract people from different backgrounds as far as that is concerned. That data is very interesting as well, Adam, as you said, because the opposite, as I said also when I stated that, was if you put on the job description, you take away the years, and if you put the salary on there, you'll see an increase from people of color applying from that regards, because they feel like, oh, you know what I'm saying? We've always had this, we're working from behind perspective. And so in the regards of trying to catch up, if you say, hey, this is a $75,000 or $80,000 a year job, and I'm sitting here and I have the talent, the skill sets, and I'm making 45, and I'm living in Minnesota, I might want to apply for this job because I'm meeting maybe 10%, 20%, or all 100% of the job description as a person of color, just because you placed that on the there. I don't know, Roderick has something to add too.
Any other questions? I've been answering some questions in the chat. So as you
not a problem.
Things in the Q&A, I'm
there
trying.
There was another question. Let me see. Did it leave, or did you already answer that? You probably already answered it, did you? Kevin Wren has a question.
That may be something we can answer live, but you can ask it.
Sure. So how much of what we discussed stems from efforts to sustain and bolster white supremacy versus racism? Also, are these two things the same? I'll repeat that. How much of what we discussed stems from efforts to sustain and bolster white supremacy versus racism? Also, are these two things the same?
Yes, I answer that real quick. So yes, they are the same. yes, because so racism, if we're talking about the U.S. context, white supremacy, racism, supremacy. So I, as a Black person, like, you know, when people say reverse racism, it's because of lack of understanding what racism is. So racism is a system. Like, it really is like the Matrix. If you ever seen the movie The Matrix, go watch The Matrix. Like, it is a system. And so a system wants to survive. A system wants to evolve. It wants to maintain an order that it believes is natural, that was constructed. Like, you know, all these little terms were constructed. So, you know, white, Black, you know, and Native, I mean, all these are constructed. These are social terms, but they have a lot of power, right? And so the ideology, it wants to survive because it was really based on this type of, you know, winner takes all or win lose type of ideology. Who has a right to certain privileges? Who is deserving of certain privileges? And it's so systemic. It's so deep. So if you don't understand the context, if you don't go and read the book, The Color of Law, The Color of Laws, all these, there's a lot of books, but just to understand the depth of it, because then it just makes you you're able to have a different type of conversation. You're able to talk with people to kind of demystify some of these, you know, misperceptions of what racism and white supremacy is. Because what will happen if you are talking to a white person, those are triggering words. And so when you use the words without understanding what they mean, you instantly get into an argument. And that's not the point. Like, what you're trying to do is educate. and say, hey, this is a system that's created, but it's harmful for both of us, right? It's really not helping both of us. If anything, it's probably helping only people who identify as white and are rich, and that's been since the beginning because they were the ones who constructed it. And so you have to be able to have those conversations and understand that in order to dismantle it, in order to undo these harms, you do have to understand that if you had a race of people, Native Americans, or Indigenous Americans and Black people, who really were looked at as not even human, like second class, like chattel, like just property, that was the basis of society in the U.S. That's the U.S. was built on that. That just doesn't go away with the stroke of a pen or the firing of a gun, the surrender of a war. It doesn't, because it got passed on because people were angry. There are people that were, it's not like the war was over. People said, you know what, you're right. We should be anti-racist. People are like, you know what, we're gonna find a way to double down, and we're not gonna violate the law, out front, but we're gonna find a way to undermine the spirit of the law. We're gonna find a way to drag our feet. We're gonna find a way to come up with every delaying tactic. We're gonna find a way to dismantle everything that was meant to advance Black people in general with affirmative action or all these different policies, social policies as well. We're going to take away all those safety nets. We're going to create the war on drugs. We're going to sell crack, in the Black community to fund, a war in Latin America, right? In the countries. You should look up that and understand what these different wars that were in Latin America and then in Iran, and how drug money was used to fuel that. But that drug money was put in, drugs were put into the Black community, just like with the Tuskegee experiment. When you look at like Dr. Page said, while a lot of Black people in general, I'm not saying every Black person, but in general, those things get passed down, just like racism gets passed down. I have a lot of white friends that tell me, yeah, that's what I heard at the table. My parents talking about Black people in very negative ways. I may not agree with it, but that's what I grew up with. And so it affected me. It's in me, even though I don't want it to be in me. But those things got passed down as well. So people said, hey, I don't trust doctors. Like I grew up in that type of, household where people, they wanted to go to a doctor if it's a Black doctor, but they were like, hey, we're really loath to go to a doctor because that got passed down to them as well.
And we have another question from Kelly. Have you seen ways that companies are meaningful, compensating, recognizing the mentoring of BIPOC professionals are doing within their presentations or organizations? No. I'm a firm believer that if you ask me to do something around the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, and it is not in my job description, you should be extra compensated. I say that as also as a DEI strategist. This is strategy that we're talking about and some of the things we shared with you this evening. Not everybody can do this work. And what we've seen when I talk about performative acts, what we've seen a lot of organizations say, oh, well, Roderick, you're a Black man, or B, you're Asian Pacific Islander. I'm going to go ahead and give you this DEI title in this role, and you can help us lead the whole strategy for the whole organization. Not everybody looks like me is a DEI strategist. Not everybody can do the work. They can talk about lived experiences. That doesn't mean they can carry the weight or the load of a whole organization. So when you go on LinkedIn, when you go into all these organizations, right now, everybody's hiring a chief diversity officer or a DEI strategist or somebody that's doing DEI work within their organization. What they're not doing also is compensating those individuals. So those ERG groups, those different individuals that are trying to move up, they're not compensating them. But I'll give you an example. If I'm working in higher education like I do right now, and if I've decided to be named interim or moved over in my career experience into another role or taking another office, I'm compensated for that. So what we do is we want people to do this work. And what happens is someone like Tierney or Roderick says, oh yeah, I'm down to do that work, but then I'm not being compensated. And then my Black tax is not happening. And so what I end up paying is that Black tax or that Native American tax or that Latinx tax, as far as that's concerned, or LGBT tax, because we're carrying the water and we're carrying the weight, yet not being compensated for it. And if, like Roderick said, if we're about the bottom line, this will drive innovation, will drive resources, will drive the profit. And so I should be a part of that, and I should be compensated for that. But to answer your Kelly, I'm not seeing that in most organizations. They're hiring for the roles, but when they put a committee together, they're not compensating the committee. They're not compensating the individuals. They might say, "Oh, I'm gonna take something off your plate," and I'm like, compensate people.
And Kelly, let me add to that. That is great, Dr. Bates. And this goes back to the idea of fit. All right. And it goes back to, say, for example, there's a whole generation of Black people that were doing a lot of leadership work, but that companies were considering leadership based on the way that they define as leadership, based on the way they had in their job description. So, for example, you have scores of Black community leaders. Like, there are a lot of Black people, especially today, but more so in my father's generation, that were doing a lot of leadership work in the community. I mean, the type of leadership that you would say, "Wow, I want that person. This is the person I want to advance my organization." But that leadership wasn't valued. So, just like mentoring, for example, a lot of times you have people within organizations. Now, if that isn't coded into the performance evaluations, then you don't get recognized and compensated, because that's how you get compensated, right? So you may not get cut a little check on the side for mentoring, but if it's a part of the performance evaluation, the annual appraisal evaluation of however often the company decides to do it, mentoring is a quality that they say, hey, how we define leadership or how we define XYZ is mentor, da, 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 da. And so what evidence can you present to show you've mentored a colleague or a subordinate or even, a superior, and how has that impacted positively the organization? I'll take it a step further. Have you mentored or done these same things with people in the community? So that's why if you look at the scorecard, I talk a lot about the community, because what you will find is a lot of companies, they compensate you in a alternative way. It's not in a way that puts more money in your pocket, but I will be fair and say they compensate you, the more conscious companies are giving you volunteer hours. So they'll say, hey, you get 40 hours or 80 hours per year to go volunteer for causes or organizations that you care about. So there's a form of compensation, right? So it's just like paid time off, but it's like paid time to do what you love or do, contribute how you want. If that is baked into the performance appraisal system as well, then it could get reflected and it could really, raise the boat, so to speak, for people who may not have those leadership opportunities within the organization. The problem, like Dr. Bates is saying, is like, if that's not even recognized as this is something, Dr. Bates, he's our Black guy, so we're going to get you to do all this other stuff, but that's just because you're the Black guy, versus, hey, this is a leadership opportunity if you're doing either external to the organization that reflecting your performance evaluation, or you're doing internal to the organization through your volunteer work or through your mentoring, informal mentoring, formal mentoring, what have you. And we're going to recognize that in the performance evaluations. We're going to codify it, so to speak, because it would be a line item in there, and it would be something that we look for in future leaders.
The next
Can I get y'all, Tierney, just let me ask one quick question. Sure. And then take that last one. One of the things that I think continues to be a challenge with organizations, because we've all been at a bunch of different organizations. One of the things that people always say is, well, I would love to hire so-and-so, but they don't apply. They don't want to work in Knoxville. They don't want to work they don't want to go to, like, we all want to go to the club every night in Atlanta. I mean, that it's just this mindset, right? That people of color do not want to go to Minnesota, or don't want to go to Montana, or don't want to go to Omaha. I think people don't understand that there are BIPOC folks in all those places, right? And the institutions where we work can't control, we don't care about how many barbershops there are, because we don't find somebody cut our hair. We did that in undergrad, right, Tierney?
This is true.
But for the rest of us, it's about controlling the climate. See, the one thing that non-BIPOC folks don't understand is that we have a really small world. I'm just speaking the higher ed world. One of my colleagues, Bernadette, says, Adam, you know everybody. Well, I've been in the game for a while. I know somebody knows somebody. So I'm going to call up Tierney and say, hey, I'm thinking about going there. What do you think? Is it going to be all right? Or am I just going to be packing up in 9 months, right? So talk a little bit about the importance of not only recruiting, because I think there's this mindset with boomers and even our generation, right, Gen X, that, oh, you're lucky to have a job. But see, that's not how millennials and Gen Z think. And that's definitely not how millennials and Gen Z who are BIPOC think. They like, shoot, I'll go get a job anywhere. I mean, right? And so talk a little bit about how active recruiting strategies are important with creating a diverse, equitable, right, anti-racist workforce, and then how important it is to control the climate so that you can retain those people.
Yeah, Adam, you're hitting everything on the head from that perspective. Millennials and Generation Z, they feel like, hey, if this ain't the place for me, I'll start my own thing too. This is the most entrepreneurial generations, these last two generations, than ever before as well. So I'll give you a prime example of that. It's my experience in Knoxville, Adam, right? When I moved to Knoxville, Tennessee, working at the University of Tennessee, I didn't know a soul, didn't know the community as a whole and everything like that. And when my time there, we were able to found the Young Professionals Organization through the Knoxville Urban League. That was a tool for us to create community. And Kevin Wren, who's on call, will understand what I'm talking about tonight, where we're able to help organizations, not only the University of Tennessee, but Oak Ridge, National Labs, TVA, major Fortune 500 companies that looked in that area, because a lot of people know Scripps Network, their headquarters in Knoxville, Tennessee. So DIY, Food Network, they're housed right there in Knoxville. And they would go to New York, they would go to LA, and they're trying to recruit BIPOC folks to come to Knoxville, Tennessee. If you don't create an atmosphere outside of your institutions where you have a community that can support individuals. Well, like you said, I can find somebody to cut my hair, but it's a matter of I got to go somewhere where I can get a good fish sandwich. Or where's the church I attend? As a woman of color, where do I get my hair done? Because it's different for me and Adam. We can just shave our heads bald, right? And so it's one of those things that you start building community outside, but also what are the roles you're building those communities in? Are they entry-level, mid-level, senior-level individuals that you're trying to attract? And I'm a firm believer that you do pay people of color a little bit more to attract them to your institution. Why? I say that for the simple fact that if I was a top white male in this country and I told you, here's my price, you would pay for me to come to Omaha, Nebraska. So it's the same thing you need to do for when you recruit your BIPOC communities as well. We also realize as you create those different communities outside of your organization to help support them and navigate that, Roderick mentioned earlier, when you have the mentorship from senior leaders to entry-level leaders, whether they look like me or not, it also creates an atmosphere of like, oh, I want to stick around because I have an opportunity to come up or rise up in this organization as a whole. And all that is very key and critical to an organization moving forward as well, because you'll see, like Adam mentioned, is the revolving door because you can't keep everybody. I laughed in Knoxville, Adam, I know you were probably laughing. It was a 7-year cycle. I would like to say, average folks that I was there for 7 years. And in 7 years, the average people that looked like me would come, stay 5 to 7 years and leave. Part of the reason was they were so talented, Knoxville couldn't hold them back. 2, Knoxville as a whole had a problem because when it came to promoting and recruiting more talent from that perspective, it was always that fit. And so somebody like me, who was very involved, very engaged in the community, had to leave Knoxville to go somewhere else where I felt like I could have planted roots in Knoxville, but the community was like, oh, I only see you as being in one space. I couldn't see you fitting over here or doing this. When all that reality, if you're in management, if you're doing business or anything like that, we have transferable skills that most of our students have. And so our students will go to Omaha, they will go to Minnesota from that perspective. But if you don't create something internally and externally to help them and support them, that's a key. Dating is big for young professionals. You know what I'm saying? They realize if they make enough money, I'll go to Minnesota and I can fly to Atlanta on the weekends. Those are just different things you got to think about because this generation is about location versus the job. And location, it is important. There's a reason why where we live at in RDU area, Austin, Nashville, all these hot spots are now starting to blow. It's because the young creatives, these millennials and Generation Z are going there and they're creating their own pathways and ways to where they can, I like to say, become big fish in small ponds. I think we had a question about equality and equity. I like to say, here's the biggest difference. Equality is that I can give myself and Roderick a job. Equity is making sure Roderick has what he needs to do the job. Roderick might need extra help. Roderick might need new technology. He might need certain things. So when it comes to equity, what most of our organizations and corporations don't understand is that you have to right historical wrongs. A prime example, if we read The Color of Money, you talk about banking. The US government used to put about $300, $400 million into Black banks. Why not put 50% of all treasury funds into Black banks? Of course, that was not going to happen because the people who look like me weren't on the treasury fund and weren't participating. But it was their way underneath Nixon, Carter, and Reagan to say, we're invested into the communities of color, right? And so that is just a process to say they're invested, but why don't those banks still exist? People don't realize Bank of America was started in San Francisco and was an Italian-American bank. but nobody does their history to study on that and don't understand it. To this day, we all know about Bank of America. It's here down in Charlotte. It's Bank of America Stadium. It's very huge where we live at, as far as I'm concerned. You can go to a Bank of America ATM anywhere. Think about that. It started off as an Italian immigrant American bank, is now a global bank here in the United States. I've never heard of Mechanic and Farmers, which is located here in Durham, North Carolina, which is historically one of the oldest still living banks for Black folks in this country, having to be able to say, I have a ATM in San Francisco or Cleveland, Ohio, or Minnesota. And that's the difference. They were able to have the capital to move forward, to expand from that perspective, even though the government was telling us we're putting about $300, $400 million to these banks. But everybody knows with banks, money can't sit, has to rotate, has to go in and out. And so if those can't loan that money, because guess what? They can only loan to people who look like me. And with people like me, I didn't have the doctorate degree. I didn't have the job that my grandfather could have did with a college degree. He was the janitor at a high school. Those are the things that were the stop gates for us, and the reason why we have the problems and the systematic things today.
That's really good. Thank you all. Thank you all for hanging around. Thank you all on a Friday night. We appreciate you guys taking the time, sharing your wisdom, sharing your knowledge with everyone. Kelly, if you're still on, can you put in the Q&A, apologize for some of the tech stuff on the settings, but can you put in the Q&A the feedback survey? Because I'm sure Dr. Bates and Mr. Lewis would love your feedback. I've known Dr. Bates since his Akron, Ohio days. So he's gonna want your feedback. We want your feedback. Okay, so please, Kelly B, if you can throw that in the Q&A. And just a reminder about a couple, our next Real Talk is gonna be coming up on March 17th with Lisa Young, the Dope Black Social Worker. So dopeblacksocialworker.com, check that out. She's going to be talking about historic marginalization and oppression of Black and BIPOC folks by the social work and education industries, co-facilitated by Dr. Kelly Collins, who's our student success coordinator for Native students. We are also going to be hosting two big events. We're in the middle of celebrating our story, or what folks call Black History Month, but it's our story, right? So we are in the midst of that. We will be having in a couple of weeks, Latasha Brown from Black Voters Matter, who changed the face of Alabama, Mr. Lewis, and also changed the face of Georgia, her and Stacey Abrams with their great work. So she will be coming in virtually on February 23rd. And then in March, Women's Her Story Month, we are going to do a fabulous array of events led by Sam Poindexter, our Women's and LGBTQ Student Services Coordinator, some STEM brown bags, some conversations. The highlight will be a virtual town hall with the amazing Tarana Burke, founder of the Me Too movement. So virtually, we're all going to gather and spend time with each other. Thank you all so much for being with us. Give Dr. Bates and Mr. Lewis your snaps for a fantastic presentation. Y'all have a safe and wonderful weekend. B, thank you for all your work. Wishing everybody all the very best. Stay safe and stay healthy.